Okay, good morning, and thank you to all the organizers and donors here who made this event possible. Michael McNulty, I'm from the National Democratic Institute. I work on our elections team out of Washington. I liked the way Moore Rubenstein summed up the buzzwords this morning. Unfortunately, I'm presenting on a buzzword, but the point about this speech is not about sort of talking about open election data, but how do we do things with the open data. It was encouraging to see the last speaker show the possibilities of data and how you can use it. I would actually say open election data is in its infancy. That shows the possibilities. What I'll talk about are things that need to even just get started before we can actually use open election data effectively. So first, a lot of people in the room aren't from an electoral background. I just want to emphasize why elections are so important and why they matter to everybody in this room. There are several obvious points. If they're held credibly, they help peacefully resolve the transfer of power. They help us all hold our elected officials accountable. And they also allow us to elect those who reflect our will and to do what we want them to do to represent us. Now, those are obvious things. However, any of you who have issues that you care about, the environment, human rights, tolerance, anything you care about, elections are the time to make those things heard, right? There's candidates, there's parties. They're the ones who are going to get your change done. And so if you ignore elections, if you ignore politics, you're missing the entire chance to affect change. So they're an intersection of many things. Now, all of this depends on them being held credibly, and most elections around the world, well, all elections around the world actually are flawed in many ways. So all of us have a responsibility to push for elections to be held more credibly, and transparency and open election data are one way to do that. Elections are not just a day, they're not an event, they are an entire process that takes place. The day an election ends, the next election cycle starts up. And so for all of you who engage on elections or want to engage on elections, you need to be aware of all of the different parts of the process, right? There's a legal framework. There's a voter registration period in most countries. There's a campaign. There's political party registration. You can walk through each of these steps, and at any point in this process, we all have a chance to engage and push for them to be made better. And actually, as we've seen in many countries around the world, those who want to manipulate elections are doing it not on election day. They're doing it in the legal framework. They're doing it with the voters list. They're barring certain candidates from running, so they're doing it during the registration period. And they're also doing it through the judicial process during dispute and resolution. So we need to be paying attention to all these things. Now, in each of these parts of the process, there's data. Data is not just about election results. It's about the data on are parties or candidates registered, and if not, why not? Is the voter registration period fair? Is the voters list accurate? Is it complete? Is voter education being conducted, and if so, to whom and on what messages? We need the data on all of this. Every part of this process must be transparent for us in this room and everyone to know if they can trust the elections. Ultimately, the elections belong to the people. They don't belong to the election commission. They don't belong to the government. They don't belong to the candidates. They belong to the voters, and thus the voters and the civic groups, the technologists and the media need and demand and have a right to access to any and all parts of the process. So we talked about this being at an infancy stage, but momentum is gathering, partly because of demand from people in the room like yourselves, from civil society groups, from the media, demanding more information, finally opening up election processes to get the data they need. So far, though, that's pretty much around the world focused on how do voters get better information to help them vote. How do they get information to help them make a better choice? That's great. Certain things in many countries allow voters, for example, to send in an SMS to a short code with their voter ID and get information about where their polling station is. That's great. They know where to vote then. They can also, voters can easily access information about who is running. If it's a local election, oftentimes voters don't even know who the candidates are. So tech and data has empowered them to send in an SMS or go on social media or access a website to find out who's running and their background and their platforms. And finally, voter registration. Like in Ukraine and other countries where there's active voter registration, people need to know, where do they go to get registered? Am I registered? They can check their status of registration online and their details to make sure that it's all accurate. Before they had access to this through SMS, in a lot of countries, there's a period of display of the voters list. You have to physically go all the way to a center, sometimes many kilometers away, to check even just if you're registered. So open data and tech have started to empower voters to be able to check this in real time at any given time. So that's great, but again, that's just a first step. Voters are one part of the process, but we need to be doing more. We need to take it to the next level and demand fair and credible elections, and that takes more than just voters checking their registration centers online. So some things have started to happen on this front. For example, if we have the data, if we have shape files of electoral boundaries or electoral districts, and we have the information on the number of registered voters in each of those districts, we can then analyze to see were the boundaries drawn fairly. Are there certain districts that have many more voters, which would mean less representational power? And are there some districts that have less voters, which means they actually have more disproportionate representation of power? These are key questions in many countries, including in single mandate districts in Ukraine, in the past especially. We can also check data on who was allowed to run for candidate. Are more women being denied access to run? Are they being deregistered or not registered? Or is the opposition party being denied registration disproportionately to the ruling party, for example? And then if we have data beyond just like a single registration center or a single polling station, if we have all of the data on this, we can analyze, for example, are polling stations being placed in the right areas where the voters are? Or are they being placed far from voters in opposition strongholds and close to voters in ruling party strongholds? So this is starting to get at how we use data to promote better elections. Now, NDI, the past few years, has been running and conducting an open election data initiative, and part of our aim is to do what I'm talking about, which is to help people understand what different types of election data are out there, what's the right type of data that should be put out, and then in what format. And so openelectiondata.net is the website where you can access all of these resources. The first question I mentioned, is the right data available? Elections are extremely political. Obviously, a lot is at stake. Therefore, that makes it all the more difficult for people to get the right data. We've seen people who work in open data communities all around the world. You know, there's a facade that governments put up of transparency. They release certain types of data, but the most important politically sensitive data is what's behind the curtain. That's very much the case in elections. And in order to understand that, we need to know in each of our countries what's the right type of data that you need to push for change and better elections. So on our website, we've outlined, on this openelectiondata.net website, we've outlined every part of that electoral cycle that I mentioned earlier, each category, what type of data should be available, examples of it, and then how you can actually use it to promote better elections. So I talked about electoral boundaries. This can also range over to electoral dispute resolution, to election results, and pretty much any part of the process. So it's great if you get the right data, that's one thing, but as we know, especially those of you who work on open data, it doesn't matter unless you get it in the right format and in an open manner. So what we've done is essentially developed open election data principles, drawing from the open data and open government principles that many of you have worked on over the years, to come up with 9 key principles of open election data. And again, this will apply to many other forms of data that you're all working on. The question is, though, there are 9, but they must be prioritized. You can't demand all 9 in every single country. So what we would argue is that the most important ones our timeliness in an election, because elections happen at a given time, and there's only a politically relevant window of time in which it's useful. If you get election results data a year after or a month after an election, it is completely useless if you're trying to actually push the Election Commission to correct certain discrepancies or identifying differences in election data from a polling station level and the tabulation process all the way up to the Election Commission level. Granular data is critical. That's getting it at the lowest level that's possible. Because, for example, with election results, granular data would mean the polling station level results, where the votes are counted, right? If you don't have it there, then you can't actually verify each level all the way up to the central level to understand if someone was fiddling with the numbers in between each level. So you can get it at a summary level. You can get voters list data at the summary level, but again, you will never know if you can trust that data unless you get it all the way down to the granular level. And then a couple other key ones of, you obviously want it for free. We've seen in many countries election commissions charge people for data. This is a barrier, obviously. We want it in complete format. You can't have 40,000 different files of a voters list at each individual polling station, and it takes 2 weeks to put it all together to be able to analyze it. We need it in complete format. We also need it to be machine readable or analyzable, obviously. We can't have PDF image files that have to be hand transcribed, thousands of pieces of data, or even just PDF forms that have to be scraped. Not everyone has the capability of scraping and using that effectively. So we're starting to see some impact from the use of open election data. We're starting to. A couple of examples. In Malaysia, there's a group called Bersih 2.0 that has rallied hundreds of thousands of people in the last couple of years, well, several years actually, around election reform issues. It's not easy to do. Election reform is one of the most boring subjects. They're out there. But they've been able to mobilize people because one of the things they did was they looked at the electoral districts in Malaysia, and they analyzed the data to show how disproportionately it affects opposition areas, and it waters down the vote in opposition areas and sort of over-represents the ruling party. And they've been able to use data to mobilize people around these issues. Here in Ukraine, ОПОРА did some interesting work. They do a lot of great open election data work. One of the examples from a few years ago was analyzing the application of candidates for an election and analyzing the decisions on whether or not they were registered and why. And what ОПОRА found was a lot of the candidates were being not registered due to very minor technical issues, completely, not substantive issues. And so they were able to highlight how that made the elections in Ukraine less competitive and gave voters fewer choices. A couple other resources I just wanted to touch on. On our website, in one region at least so far, we've done an inventory of open election data in Latin America. We've looked at each part of the process and determined, is it open, is it not mostly open, or is it not open? And we'd love to do this in other regions of the world, but right now it's only Latin America. We also have an election data academy with a lot of different modules that I think most of you who are interested in data analysis might find helpful. Very practical exercises on how to obtain data, clean it, manipulate it, and analyze it. It applies beyond elections. A couple of last points. There's a lot of lessons we've learned as well as broader debates out there around opening up election data. A lot of times in countries, the Election Commission or the government might say, well, we don't have the capacity, we don't really know how to open it up, we don't have the technical capabilities. So we have to understand, approaching governments politically is important to help understand where their challenges and understanding that we can't have all 9 election data principles all at once. Starting from the most important issues, the most important data, and the most important principles first, and building up from there is acceptable in certain countries. If you're approaching a government entity, we've found it's much harder for them to retrofit, to make data open after they've already developed their entire system or developed an entire website for accessing their data. The time to do it is when they're redesigning a website or redesigning an electoral system. Much cheaper and easier to make sure you get into that phase and help them and push for them to open up the data as opposed to trying to retrofit an older website. There are some trade-offs in terms of open data and open election data, but a lot of these trade-offs I would also frame as excuses. So governments or election commissions might say, well, you know, open data, it's hard, it slows things down, you know, it makes things less efficient, or we're worried about privacy or the security of our data. These are legitimate concerns, but the examples of commissions that have done a good job of open data show that each of these issues can be addressed fairly easily if they're thought through and they consult with people on how to protect their data responsibly. It's not really as big of a challenge as some might argue. Okay, I just wanted to wrap up on technologies and elections more broadly. I know this is the optimistic panel, but we can't ignore the fact that technology is being used around the world in elections much more, whether it be for electronic voting, electronic counting, for electronic transmission of results, or biometric voter registration. So there are some good things, obviously. This speeds up the process. It can make things more accurate. It can add some additional layers of verification when voters are registering. They can, you know, have an additional biometric measure to make sure that they're actually the person they say they are and not just forging a registration card. So there are some good things, but there's a lot of bad things that come with it. It's harder to secure the data and just the process in general. It actually makes things less transparent. So those like ОПОРА who are trying to observe the process have a harder time of penetrating that black box of technology. Then the flat truth is that a lot of election commissions and governments, we see this with technology everywhere, they're just jumping at the shiny tool without actually strategically deciding, okay, we have a problem with our election, what is the right tool to fit that problem? And instead, vendors are just coming at them with all these really cool sounding tools and they're just jumping and grabbing it, and it ends up being more costly, not sustainable, hard to maintain over the years, and unfortunately results in a lot of rushing to implement a nationwide technological change without doing the necessary pilots over the years that needs to be done. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to encourage you to, again, go to the website, and I'm going to do a session tomorrow at 9:30 on election data analysis and visualization. So we'll take some of this stuff in a more practical direction then. So thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you.